Thank you, Patrick. And I will share my screen just to walk us through the intro CARC slides. And I just want to say good morning, everybody. It's nice to see everyone. I'm sure some of us are busy. I know there's a deadline today at NSF, if not many others as well. So I will just get started here. Okay. So can you all see my screen? Good. Okay. Thanks, Pat. All right. I'll make this a little bit bigger. And Patrick just showed me how to there. Okay. And on we go. So just a quick walk through for those of you that might be new, or as a refresher, just a quick intro to the organization. So this organization came about several years ago through a couple of awards and a lot of hard work by many, many people across the community to advance the frontiers of research by really helping us to become a coherent community of practice and improve our effectiveness both across the HPC or the research computing communities, as well as data professionals. And this has been a huge boon, I'll just say that, to the people that I work with, because, and I know many of you are in the same place. We work with people sort of on both sides of the data processes or the research lifecycle. So this organization has been tremendously helpful for many of us. And in addition to these areas of engagement, there are also some working groups. So I'll get to those in a second, but you can see here the sort of the organization of how the professionalization is sort of shaking out and being led by the organization and the work that's happening here. I won't read all these slides. I always can answer questions if people have them. And right, so year-round virtual conference. This is sort of part of that virtual conference. Our videos will be available on YouTube afterward. And we are the strategy and policy facing track, and welcome your participation. Okay, so some specific working groups at CARC include that effort to help develop the processes and awareness on professionalization of the research computing and data communities, thinking about career arcs and what that means for people to have trajectories to move out and up through different kinds of roles in this professional sphere. The capabilities model, which supports both self and sort of aggregated assessment of RCD on a particular campus, and helps indicate places where we might make improvements or shore up our services when where we are able. And then engagement. So working group to really do outreach and make sure that we are engaging people from every walk of life in the US and helping facilitate expansion of the community. Okay, so let's get involved. Here's some ways to join if you're not on the mailing list and you'd like to be. The website, we'll make sure, I think that's come to our events is the website link. And there are all kinds of ways to find information on the CARC website. Here's the our strategy and policy steering committee, and the list of people that work together on a regular basis to help bring this programming to life. In April, so we generally meet the first Wednesday of the month at 9 a.m. Pacific and noon Eastern time on April the 5th. This is the topic that we'll be shifting toward. We'll be building on, frankly, we'll be using this session and the last session to help us really to build on that and start to focus on KPIs and thinking about outcomes and aims that we can measure, and how we go about that. Today is part 2 of a series on exploring factors that impact RCD strategy on individual campuses or in collaborative campus arrangements. And so we look forward to hearing our speakers. And before we do that, I just would like to spend a moment I'm going to stop sharing now. And I would like to spend a moment just to bring everyone's attention to the CARC Code of Conduct. The link is in our meeting notes for today, and I would just like to remind everyone with a positive note and say, one of the things I like about this Code of Conduct is that it actually starts out with the good behaviors rather than telling us right up front what we shouldn't be doing, because I think we sort of have a sense of that, but certainly there's a good list, long list of things that are not accepted toward the end. But there's this is a nice comprehensive code of conduct about both the organization and everyone's interactions in our year-long activities and virtual meetings, including rules about privacy and confidentiality, and a link in case someone needs to report behavior. There's a form that you can link to about halfway or toward the bottom of the web page. So thank you for that. I'm not going to read any more of that, but we we look forward to having a congenial and professional conversation today. And thank you.
So with that, we want to welcome our three speakers, Patrick Clemens from the University of Vermont, Don DuRousseau from University of Arkansas, and Paul Wicklum from UC Santa Barbara. Again, this is a fairly informal discussion addressing sort of what they see at their campus that's really influenced how they've shaped their program. And we can either go in the order that they're listed, or if any of you is eager to get started, feel free to speak up. If you guys have slides, you can go ahead and screen share, but if you don't have slides, that's fine too. We can just have the discussion.
If there's no set order, it's going to get noisy behind me. We're having a JMP event here, and so I thought before it gets started, I might at least.
All right, go for it, Don. Thanks.
Well, great, thanks. So I'm Don DuRousseau, Director of Research Technology at University of Arkansas, and the way I got started in this was I knew a little bit about the EPSCoR Nexus coming in from prior work, but I wrote a NSF CIRA planning grant, and so part of the planning grant included our developing and pushing out the RCD-CM on our campus, and then there were 7 other institutions that were part of the planning grant. So we were doing a little bit to pilot the effort for the RCDs. In first off, figuring out how we could communicate this throughout our organization, and then trying to work on some strategies that others could use. And some were within the system, and 3 universities were outside the system, the A State, and then Southern Arkansas and Central Arkansas. So it was really started off with engaging both the research leadership and the IT leadership on all of the campuses. And so that was, since they were the players in the NSF grant, we already had that connectivity. The other part was that we had a large multi-institutional EPSCoR grant that connects like 20 institutions, and all of these 8 were part of that. So we kind of had a driver behind this for both the research, economic development, and the need for collecting or connecting researchers and providing the research infrastructure. So that's where the HPCs were being connected, and we're working at the state level on the with ARON, our REN, to connect all of the resources. So the next part is, in our grant, we essentially proposed something called the Arkansas Cyber Team, which is the support and facilitation for this platform called the Arkansas Research Platform. And so the way we started was to take I work very closely with Laura Leonards, our system librarian, and she supports many of the other institutions, and we started to look at the survey from the perspective of who on the campus needed to be engaged And then Laura started to break it apart to where if we have a certain research group, rather than sending multiple copies of the survey around, she kind of customized them into groupings that might include multiple facings, but we're targeting one particular group, maybe like the HPC administrators, right? Across facings, they would get a compilation of the questions. And so we put that together and then started reaching out to leadership to inform them of the survey and get permission for their staff to participate. I think we had 26 groups consisting of 58 individuals across the campus. And we did not look at researchers. We looked at the providers of research support services, compliance like ITAR and AIR services, things, you know, those who would be participating in the facings, but not necessarily doing research in those, mainly to understand what, you know, where we were lacking in communications, in sharing. And then we sent the surveys out. I think we gave it about 2 months to gather back all of the surveys, and then Laura recompiled them and submitted them. I think, Patrick, they came in after the 2020 deadline, right? But I'm sorry, 2022 deadline, but we at least have our individual results against the group. And so we use that to essentially look at not just how well we were doing against our peer institutions, but how well we were doing on campus with respect to delivering the services. And we tried to use that, you know, 4-point Likert type, you know, the same approach that you took, color-coded measures of what we were doing very well, what we were doing good, what we were moderate on, and what was sadly lacking, right? And then we looked at each of those across the facings and you know, generated some pretty charts and graphs showing that and showing which facings are tied to each of these and which categories. And we are now in the process of socializing the effort. We're about to start to package, you know, our presentation. Laura's working on a video of our results, and we're pushing through on the process. So that's kind of where we are right now. I don't know if you want to hold questions off or if you want to do anything with that now.
I've got a couple of quick questions, and others may have questions too. Where do you guys report on campus, Don?
In my office, I'm in ITS, so I'm in the under the CIO through the ACIO in our organization. The HPC environment is under research, under the research office, and that's managed by, it's called the Arkansas High Performance Computing Center. And so they're not part of ITS. Okay. So the resources, so part of the grant was, the planning grant was to build the science DMZ on our campus and to use that as the template for UAMS's science DMZ so that we can connect both the two gateways, the open on-demand gateways, exceed resources, and also share the elastic cloud store between the universities. This becomes the gateway for all other universities to reach, you know, the core. But the other side of the grant is to support it with people, and that's what the RCD CM is to highlight what we're missing. Okay.
And beyond the grant funding, do you have what has been are there other funding vehicles for you on campus, either recharge or campus funding?
Well, there's the DART grant. That was the $20 million, $24 million grant, but that's more focused on the, you know, the collaborative research and the teaching, a lot of grad students in there, a lot of things like that, and on the infrastructure. So there's some money in there, but staffing is limited in NSF grants. Right. So funding this has been just, you know, it's typically a pass the hat model. There's no funds at the smaller schools. I'm doing this within our broader research planning and integration. So there's some support from within IT, but trying to get more support on the library side. There's a lot happening there. We've got a new dean of libraries, so that is a potential avenue for support. And then that's why, because we're an EPSCoR state, we're participating in, in the Nexus efforts as well, and wherever we can there.
So how much would you say that the idea behind this sort of collaborative effort among all the schools in Arkansas, because you've got a pretty strong collaborative effort going on there around research computing data. How much of that was grassroots from the schools, and how much of it do you think was really driven by the EPSCoR initiatives?
Yeah, it's a lot of it is the EPSCoR. So the grassroots happened at the main campus, and then at UAMS, because they each had their own clusters. They finally got enough awareness in the state to say, hey, we've got these two HPC clusters, let's connect them together. And that started the conversations between the chancellors at the two universities, that at least they would connect their researchers, the medical side, and then the genomics and ag side, and and space sciences, that kind of stuff we do up here. And then that grew into the DART grant. And then when I got here, I wrote the SHARP grant to support the DART grant with the pieces that were missing. That's the first goal of the SHARP grant is put a CI plan in the hand of each of the small schools.
Okay.
Right. So with a CI plan, they can get funding. Without it, it goes in the trash.
And the DART grant was that an EPSCoR track 1?
EPSCoR track 1, yeah.
Can you very briefly, there's a bunch of people on the call that may not be familiar with how EPSCoR funding works. And if you could just explain a little bit about where those big grants come from and what they're intended for.
Yeah, so EPSCoR is NSF's version of funding underfunded states primarily. It's called IDEA states in NIH, grant worlds. But predominantly the middle of the nation and a couple other locations have not received the same level of competitive funding from NSF and NIH. And so in NSF's case, they call this EPSCoR there's the acronym. It pretty much means that it's for economic opportunities for underfunded states and organizations. And so EPSCoR has set aside funding for track 1, track 2 awards. They're typically very large, multi-institutional, multi-year, 5 years with potential extensions on them around a particular area of whatever NSF is looking to support at that time. And in this case, it was research cyber infrastructure. It was the collaborative efforts across multiple institutions, and then also the teaching, and of course the infrastructure access, right? So the gateways, the portals, and the use of Exceed and on-demand resources. That was all part of the EPSCoR. It was called DART, for Data Are Robust and Trusted in Arkansas. And so that money is a special track within typically the somewhere under size or one of the other offices in NSF.
So we can either, if people have specific questions to Don who want to jump in, otherwise we can keep moving and we'll have a more open discussion. Scotty?
Sure. Kind of a loaded question for Don, because I'm starting to work on the advisory group for the Arkansas EPSCoR. I'm also trying to make heads or tails of things. So do you see your SHARP efforts as, not just getting CI planning in the hands of the smaller institutions, but do you see that having an influence on, we'll call it, the higher level architectural cooperation or development for all of the institutions, including, the big heavy hitters in the system office? Because it seems to me like there's still a lot of scattered discussion at that level, even if the smaller institutions are getting a handle on things.
Yeah, great point. And and yes, there in a theoretical world, it would all be integrated. And yeah, but it's three systems, not just one system office. So system office is where typically EPSCoR lives, and it's, you know, UA Fayetteville and Little Rock and UAMS, of course. But everyone has fiefdoms and everyone has their own domain. And first off, if you can at least start with cordiality between system and the independent universities, that would be a great place to start. I'm not sure that's the case in Arkansas, but it really comes down to risk appetite. And that's why I started out with, let's define the science DMZ. Actually worked with Trusted CIO. I wrote a white paper on how essentially to convince your CIO that a science DMZ is safe and research cyber infrastructure can be protected, right? At least for open science. So, but I guess to get to your point, it's really the willingness of the CIOs to play. The researchers all want to play, right? They don't necessarily know what exists. And so having better communications about what is freely available out there, you know, especially when Google and AWS love to come to a researcher and say, we've got free storage for you, right? And they don't know how much is available already in Arkansas. We've got petabytes and petabytes of storage, right? But they don't know it's there. So that's a problem. That's what I'm trying to work on with Sharp, is that part. But the broader piece is, for all this to come together, we have to agree on the virtual organization called the Arkansas Research Platform, right? That's what stitches everything together. That's what includes Aaron, so that we have harmonized policies, because everybody's policies on campus for access and control and use of resources is going to be different, right? For us, I want NIST 800-171 at least leading up to the boundary of the science DMZ. That's not the case at UAMS. They've got different members. They've got other institutions that have to play. So we have to harmonize policies for the research infrastructure that can be still workable on campus for the individual campus policies, right? That's the piece that I don't see the support yet. I'll leave it at that. I don't quite see that system level support, because it needs to come down from the governor.
Thanks for the insight, Don. I really appreciate that answer.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, the system-wide approach that you're taking there is certainly ambitious, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, the schools want to do it. The individual, you know, research leaders and most of the CIOs, especially at the smaller schools, really want to see this happen.
Yeah.
Right. That's why I'm trying to help them as much as I can, but there's a limit.
Yeah. So, Patrick or Paul, who wants to go next? Oh, Deb's got a question.
Yeah. So I'm really curious how the state schools relate to the actual state government. So like, for example, Michigan, there's three main schools, MSU, and Wayne State are branches of government. And now at Arizona, there's three that are part of the state. So like, I am a state employee of Arizona working at Arizona State.
Yeah, if it's not a private institution, it falls in under the Department of Education and up to the governor's office. I mean, in Arkansas, they're doing major things and coming down out of that pipeline. So it's policy based. And then you've got to get the CIOs to agree with the system CIO, right, and how they're going to align to meet that set of policies coming down. I'll give you an example. TikTok just came down, right? There was confusion. There was then misalignment. There was system demands, and then there was how everybody's going to meet those demands and how that alignment had to take place. And so imagine that on an entire research infrastructure and multiple independently operated clusters in regions on the other ends of the state. Right. So it's policies. It's all gonna have to be about a set of policies coming down from the state office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I want to make sure we have
Yeah.
time for the others. Patrick or Paul, who wants to jump in?
I'm fine if you want me to go next.
Okay.
I did make a few slides just so that to keep me from rambling, but it may not prevent me. Hold on. Sorry, I had too many windows open. So just a little bit to give you some context about me. I was in grad school 30 years ago or something now at UCLA doing chemistry and material science. And mainly a lot of the modeling I was doing, I needed the computers to be running for 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time. And at that point, central computing at the research support of computing at UCLA only supported VAX, VMS, and I forget what the IBM one was. What was that, MVS or something? And we were buying all these Unix machines. So they just said, well, you're on your own. So it forced me to learn how to do some system admin stuff just to do my own research. Ironically, I don't know if anyone from UCLA is on the call, maybe 10 years later, they put together pretty good research support. So I think, well, if I'd been 10 years later, I could have spent my whole life worrying about science rather than computers. So, but here we are. So as far as UC Santa Barbara, it's part of the UC system. So with Berkeley, UCLA, San Diego, and so on, we've about 25,000 students. A couple thousand of that are grad students. We're an R1 university. We have a long history of interdisciplinary research. When I got here in '92 as a postdoc, I was paid by some ORU. We did work with both physics and chemistry. My office was in the chemistry building. Everyone worked across all these boundaries, and that's very common now, but UCSB does have a long history of it. Another thing that makes this campus kind of interesting is there's a lot of work in marine science and earth science. Marine science, we're right on the beach, so there's several boats that operate. They go out every day collecting and doing surveys and so on. So a lot of staff gets put on that kind of work too. So it's an interesting campus in that way, that there's demands that are a little unusual just because of where we are and the type of work we do. The IT organization here, we have a central group, ETS, which does all the administrative business systems, all of that stuff. Obviously, there's overlap with research because, the campus network, everyone needs that to do anything, business or research. Cybersecurity stuff, of course, too. But most IT support for the researchers comes directly from the department. The physics department has a person that supports the people in physics. The electrical and computing engineering department is someone that supports them, and so on. So a lot of times this is one person or two people type of thing within each department, or ORU, which is a organized research unit. More recently, the library actually, out of their own interest, has taken on a lot of the data side of the world. They're really trying to help people in terms of archiving data, and not just, hey, here's somewhere to store data, but really working with them that what kind of metadata do you need to store and things like that. They became members of software carpentry and everything, but that's something that really grew out of an interest the head librarian had, which is a lot of how things work here. As far as organization, because I know Patrick asked that, central IT reports to the chief information officer, who's a associate vice chancellor, and then they report up to the executive vice chancellor and chancellor. Department, all these department people I'm talking about, they report to the chair. Their chair reports to a dean, who reports to the EVC, and so on. So it's a completely different chain. But there is overlap, so that's kind of weird. UCSB, as I said, the researchers work across all sorts of boundaries, but we're not really set up to do that. And not just in IT, but even things like to buy something, it's a different process. You know, if you have money in chemistry and money in physics, they have two different processes to buy things. Slowly stuff's getting better as we're centralizing on certain systems, but it's, you know, it's going to be a long road. And I can speak of this as having been a researcher. It's frustrating when you go to submit some piece of paperwork and they're like, oh, well, no, that's how such and such does it. And you're like, I just want to turn this in, or I just want my IT support. So the idea is how to smooth that out for the people we're supporting. So our research IT does work in a federated model. We work with, like, when the person in physics, if they have someone that needs my help, I'll help out. We'll touch back on how that works. To give you a little sense of, since all of my slides I just cut and pasted from notes, I wanted to have one that had pictures, so I just grabbed this from somewhere else. So I work for the Center for Scientific Computing. It's just a cooperation between California Nanosystems Institute and the Materials Research Lab, both of which are organized research units. We do have a single facilitator from Central Campus, from the campus organization, who's in the office next door to me. We provide hardware support, so we have a number of clusters, both campus available, but also some condo clusters. We provide some limited consulting. I'll do work for people, since I'm paid by CNSI, I'll do work for people that are associated with CNSI. Jay, the facilitator, kind of has to cover everybody on campus. I'll sometimes, if it's not going to take a huge amount of time, help other people. There was a guy from the English department doing some, what I thought was cool research. So, you know, I could sink an hour or two into helping him, but certainly not any large scale. Our funding comes from the budgets of CNSI, the MRL. We do get some grants, but they're all really for science, you know, that someone's doing calculations and you can get some money for buying either a small piece of a cluster that may get folded into the condo or so on. We do have some soft funding. The MRL is a NSF MERSEC, for those of you that are into all our acronyms. So, you know, that does kind of change our priorities sometimes. The history, it's largely because the researchers within CNSI and MRL needed computing in HPC. So the original director of CNSI, Evelyn Hu, she saw this as, hey, here's a gap we can fill and our researchers need it. So primarily, we try and support the people in CNSI and MRL, but we have inherited other users. In the best case, we get them to the people from other departments. When their users are using our clusters, we get their IT staff to help them. You know, they want some crazy piece of software installed that I know nothing about, but hopefully their IT staff knows, and we'll set up an area on the cluster for them to install their crazy software. The facilitator, as I said, Jay, helps everyone, but it's one person on, as you saw, a pretty big campus. To answer the one question, the funding priorities really are CNSI and MRL. If someone from the English department needs some super fancy GPU, you can probably imagine how that goes over if I go to my director and say, hey, I want to help out the English department, spend $20,000. So that's that. The pros and cons of this model. The pros are, we're pretty nimble, right? I don't have a lot of layers. I guess actually there's a ton of layers of management above me, but as long as my director is happy, which means the researchers here are happy, I have a lot of flexibility. Some of the other UCs I know will want to do some collaboration, and it's pretty easy for me to say, yeah, sure, we'll do that, because I can pretty easily make decisions if it's not a big money thing. There's no central funding, which is bad, but it's also good in that I don't, I don't have to answer. I'm not getting money from 6 different places and now having to please 6 different people. So when I put that down as a con originally, I thought, well, in some ways it's a pro. The cons is the whim of the directors. If the people in CNSI don't do as many computations in the future, they may say, hey, we don't want to be spending all this money on that. CNSI is also a little strangely funded. We're not funded out of the campus. We're funded more directly by the state. So it's a little strange. You're dependent on a couple staff. You saw on that slide, there's 3 of us, right? We only have expertise in 3 areas wherever our degrees or backgrounds come from. Another issue is Fuzz and I and all the IT staff in the different departments are pulled in a lot of directions. I get, I have to help people out with desktop problems. The Zoom room isn't working. There's these machines, that are connected to scientific instruments. So my job is only, I don't know, quarter time HPC or research computing, or maybe half time. So then the big question, and I realize I've kind of gone off track of what I'm supposed to, but well, there you have it. How do we make this more stable? Because it does work very well in some ways. And the trick is, how do you save that stuff that works well? The faculty like it, that they know who to go to and quickly. And that usually I can remember, oh, this is that crazy machine that's connected to that other machine that does this. So they like that kind of service. So how do you maintain that? And there's sort of, I see it as 3 models. Let me put the disclaimer now. I speak with 0 authority. So this is all just my my random thoughts. You could move it under central IT. The problem with that, you kind of remove us from the researchers. We're further away. You do have a lot more staff help, right? Professional sysadmins. I'm sort of a semi-professional, I'd say. I had no real training. I've learned on the fly. And you're spread thinner. You're not necessarily always dealing with the same people. Administrative computing naturally is a very different view of computing from research and administration. I have a lot more in common with our lab managers, the people that run the NMR and the microscopy. There's certainly some past history of things that haven't gone well when they're done centrally. Something like UC San Diego and what Claire talked about last week, that's an interesting model where you layer it on top of a bunch of local IT staff. And that's, I think, certainly one we're looking at. The other is a more formalized federation, because right now it's purely on, if I call someone in some engineering department, it's just pure chance whether they're really going to be willing to help out, even if it's to help one of their researchers. So maybe formalizing that. As a side comment, there was talk of recharge. I don't work, I in the past had. What's good is you can sometimes use it to prevent people from someone saying, hey, I want you to keep this 20-year-old computer running. If you make them pay for it, they may just think twice about that. And another is at some level, everything has to be subsidized at a university. There's this talk of, oh, you should recover all your costs. Well, you can't. How do you pay for the building, the electricity, everything else? So at some level, everything is subsidized. You have to have someone running an NMR. You have to have someone emptying your trash and things like that. So that's the end of my rant.
So Paul, I'm gonna, given how we've used our time, which is partly my fault, I'm gonna ask Patrick to go ahead and do his talk, and we'll gather questions together if that's okay. So Patrick, why don't you jump in just so that we make sure that we don't run out of time for your bit, and then we'll hopefully be able to field questions for both of you.
Yeah, I'll do my bit really quick. So I'm Patrick Clemens, University of Vermont, part of the Vermont F-Score team over there. I've been with Vermont F-Score on UVM for 11 years. Just to give you a sense of the university, we're about 1,100 or 11,000 undergraduates, 1,000 grad students, plus some medical students, about 500 of those. We're solidly in the R2 category. We are the only we are the only university in the state. There's a bunch of other undergraduate undergraduate institutions scattered across, but we are by far the biggest by almost an order of magnitude. And there's only about 650,000 folks in Vermont altogether. So we are kind of coming from this very small, resource limited kind of perspective. So in terms of our organization, our CTO is Mike Austin, who really wanted to be here today, but he's camping on the side of a mountain this week, and so he's been around UVM for a while and kind of manages all of the IT, which we call ETS at UVM. And then we have a director of our VACC, Vermont Advanced Computing Center, and that is Chris Danforth, and he is a faculty member. So he is more of a strategy person and a grant writer versus, you know, the day-to-day of the management of the couple clusters that they have. He has an associate director that does some of that day-to-day, and then the ETS, Mike Austin's group, provides this system support for running the cluster. So it comes out of central IT. And there's as we've over the last decade since I've been there, we are starting to move some of those central IT ETS folks into more of like a research computing role. So while they're in the central IT group, they are kind of the research arm of it, where they focus more on the research computing side of things. So we're kind of centrally organized. We have central IT, but there's a lot of decentralized RCD folks like me out in the research groups as well. I would say the best way to think of it is that kind of the systems and data folks are more centralized, and then the more people-facing, researcher-facing folks like me are more out in the research groups. In terms of funding, we're somewhere in between, like most folks are. We have base funding for the systems and for the system support people, and then more as you get closer to the researchers, you get more grant funding. A lot of the new equipment is funded by MRIs and other kinds of grants like that, and then the refresh on the hardware is usually more institutional kind of funding. So in terms of like how EPSCoR fits into the centralized planning and, you know, vice versa. So going from like central IT and the university as a whole to EPSCoR, when we look at our track ones and we write our track ones, we try to look at what the priorities are at the university and try to fit them into our grants in some way, so that when we write that grant and fund something through our EPSCoR program, it can be transitioned to something campus-wide. So we do work very closely with our central IT and chat a lot about what they need. And when we come time to write a track one, we say, well, let's see if we can fit that into our research plan. Historically, it goes kind of more the other way, where EPSCoR establishes cyber infrastructure, which would be my role. I establish cyber infrastructure to help our researchers get their job done. And along the way, we normally need some resources that central IT doesn't have, like a Git repo or Globus or GPU processing over the course of the last 10 years. And we'll like put up a little server, pilot it just for our little EPSCoR group. And then once we see the usage and try a couple of different technologies out, and you know, in that little group, ETS will often adopt it. So there's kind of a long history over the last 10 years of EPSCoR piloting little cyber infrastructure things for research, and then those getting blown out campus-wide in a much better organized, much more well-supported, and sometimes with a more modern technology. So that's kind of my little spiel, and give a couple of minutes for questions here.
Thanks, Patrick. Really interesting. So who's got questions for either Paul or Patrick at this point, or commentary? There's been a number of great threads in the chat as well, if anybody wants to speak to some of those.
Cool. I'd like to describe Michigan Medicine's funding real quick, which I think we figured out a very good way to do it. So Michigan Medicine's Academic Medical Center for University of Michigan, and it's like a financially separate entity, so it does a lot of things on its own without the rest of the campus. And I was in central IT while I was there. That's kind of where our facilitators were. But being in central IT, we were shared services, and most of our funding came from the hospital money bucket, which meant a lot of money is prioritized for hospital things. So what we did to help researcher focused stuff get prioritized, one is we formed a faculty committee that kind of prioritized what the research IT advocated for. And then we also kind of, for those priorities, we worked with the med school to earmark some of their money, which was technically a separate bucket, but they would kind of fund some of these priorities. So, for example, our storage, the team that manages the storage gets their money from the hospital, but it's also used for researchers. So the med school funds part of the depreciation and replenishing of the storage device based on kind of usage type thing. And so that's how we managed to play nice with a lot of leadership that didn't really wasn't giving priority to research.
Interesting. Thanks, Deb. Do other people have questions or comments? Feel free to jump in.
I guess, well, let me ask everyone else. I mean, I get the sense what we're doing at Santa Barbara is not that unusual compared to a lot of other people. And I have mixed feelings about proposing anything higher up the food chain as far as how to make it more sustainable or more sensible. And I'm just wondering what other people that are in a similar situation think.
So Paul, one thing you said that, I chatted with Mike Austin, our CTO, before this to kind of get his impression. And we actually decided in that brief little phone call that we were going to do something what you were talking about where, or maybe it was someone in the chat, about kind of bringing our research facilitators from around campus that are kind of embedded in the research groups into some kind of more central, I don't want to say like administratively centralized, but at least have a central meeting like once a month or frequently to start sharing best practices, kind of try to collaborate and share hardware, things like that. Because right now we do have more of a federation, right, where each kind of research team kind of does their own thing with their own software. Our hardware is kind of centralized, but definitely not support or software. And so we're definitely moving in that direction, not administratively, but at least cooperatively.
Others, I'm although watching this lively exchange going on in chat, Fred. Bob.
Yeah, I just want to sorry, I think that's an excellent idea. I know Claire has done this as at the UC systems. I wonder if she might comment on that unless she did last week. I missed last month's meeting, and I'm curious as to how much effort that would take in terms of, personal effort, but also in terms of enthusiasm. Or I might wonder if any others might comment on that too.
So the event or the activity that Bob mentioned, what happened was years ago, I attended Henry's, now Oklahoma, virtual residency. And I was so excited about it. And my boss happened to be attending remotely, and between the two of us, we said we've got to bring this to the University of California. And so we actually did a mini research facilitators. It was like a 3-day. Paul Weekliam was part of that. Patrick was part of it. I think probably the second year, Patrick. But anyway, we tried to, we were thinking that it might end up being kind of a train the trainer eventually, where we brought that idea and allowed other systems to learn from that idea and take it to their own region. And that happened a little bit. We've had a couple people join us in subsequent years, but I don't really think it took off. And we struggled obviously with COVID to keep that up. UCLA was going to host when COVID hit, and this last year we co-located a 1-day kind of a reset meeting, and had a lot of excitement and a lot of participation. We're looking to hopefully in 2023 be able to do it again, but it's the funding piece. We don't lack in enthusiasm for people to want to do it, but it's the funding piece. Patrick mentioned earlier, we had a system-wide CIO who has now since left, and we have a new one. And so we don't have that enthusiastic financial backing for this event. So anyway, that's this.
I'll mention, in addition to what Claire's talking about, which was, it was actually a really cool program bringing together all UCs. At a campus level at Berkeley, one of the things that we were trying to do is we also had the situation where there was a bunch of embedded support. And we did a little bit of arm twisting to name people basically adjunct members of one another's teams. And there was a guy who was in statistical computing who was a great consultant for that particular area, but he was nominally only allowed to consult to a couple of departments. And initially, we just invited him to all of our meetings to talk about what he was doing. And over time, we actually worked out a deal to buy like 10% of his time, which was just enough so that we could hand tickets over to him for the campus as a whole. But a lot of it was like going to departments and saying, look, we'll expose you to everybody else and we'll give you better access to the central support if you will just hang out in our meetings. And it slowly built sort of an ethos of a network of providers. And it wasn't foolproof, but I think it actually helped on campus. Deb was a part of that when she was there as well. And, you know, in general, just getting people to think about being in a network of support providers seemed to really help. And it was, you know, and then we could get them all using a shared model for how we tracked engagements and, you know, coordinating on outreach and things like that. And so that was a pretty big win, I think.
Well, Patrick, I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's exactly what we're imagining doing. So I'm glad to hear that there's some success somewhere with a model like that.
I have another program at on our campus at UCSD where we actually co-fund a position. It's actually a systems integration engineer, but it's co-funded with one of the divisions, the Division of Physical Sciences, and the person is co-located and sits in the division in the Department of Chemistry. But it's a full member of my team. It's just half paid for by physical sciences, and is committed. 80% of his time is committed to chemistry work, or 80% of research IT's the equivalent is committed to that. And we're doing that in math now. We're just going to start that in the new fiscal year. We've got somebody who is working with us now and going to transition on July 1. And actually, I've talked about this. We've talked about this across campuses. UC Merced and I have talked a little bit about co-funding a position that might support research across the two institutions.
I think one thing that you've mentioned there, which you know, for me, it's we have our problem is not across disciplines, but across the boundary of research versus IT. And some of the things that you've said there actually do do sort of reinforce sort of that engagement and ownership and empathy, which I think is really important as a part of a facilitator, and something that we're struggling with because we're partnering with other groups to provide the full set of services. So this is very encouraging. I thank you for the suggestions. It's really given me some new trains of thought.
Yeah, just inviting people to your meetings is a good start. We have had another really interesting discussion and run right up against the boundary. I really want to thank our speakers. Don had to drop off because it was getting a little crazy where he was, but Paul and Patrick, thank you very much for coming and sharing your experiences and observations. And for everybody else, and in particular, there's a great thread going on in chat. Thanks for everybody who's contributing there. So I hope you'll join us next time when we build on some of this to say, okay, well, given our constraints and all these factors, what works at our respective institutions in terms of what we measure and how we make the case for impact. So I think that's going to be a really fun discussion as well. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you showing up and contributing to the discussion.
Thanks all.